Is this thing on? Yep. All right. All right, it's just after 3, so we'll get going. This session, we're going to talk about building a native app for Windows. Focus mostly on the .NET options here. There's too many to fit everything into an hour, so everything here is going to be pretty much .NET. My name's Alvin Ashcraft, and that's a little bit about me. I've been in the software development industry for almost 30 years now. The first 25 I spent in development architecture. Started out with VB3, moved into .NET when that came out, and spent most of my career working in Windows development. A lot of WPF years under my belt. Some of you may know me from my blog, alvinashcraft.com, where I post daily links called Dewdrops on the Morning Dew. I've written 3 books for Pact Publishing. 2 of them are first and second editions of Learn WinUI 3, and I have a parallel programming with .NET book as well. And I joined Microsoft a few years ago. I work on the Windows developer docs, talking about Windows development, the APIs, all that. And I'm also one of the organizers of the Tech Bash Developer Conference in the Poconos in Pennsylvania. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to look at just a brief history of Windows development, where it's come since .NET was introduced. We'll talk about the different pros and cons of some of those things that we'll be talking about. Windows forms, we'll look at WPF, UWP, WinUI, and the Windows App SDK. We'll look at .MAUI if you're looking to go cross-platform. And if there's time, there should be time to talk about UNO platform and Blazor hybrid. A lot of people know about doing Blazor hybrid with MAUI, but you can also do that with WinForms or WPF, and we'll be looking at a WPF project that uses Blazor. And then at the end, we'll talk about some guidelines for choosing a framework, and I'll give you some resources and other links that you can go forward with. So starting out with .NET desktop history. So back in 2002, we had Windows Forms was the first option when .NET first debuted. That was the successor to VB6 Forms. Windows Forms has the nice UI designer where you can drag and drop, build your forms very quickly. Everything is C# code or VB code, and that Forms designer has been around a long time. It was available with all the VB versions. Bill Gates demoed the first designer back in 1991. There's a YouTube video of that demo. And all my slides and everything are up on my GitHub repo. I'll talk about that at the end, so you can grab that link later. 2006 was next. With Windows Vista, we got WPF. That was the first XAML-based UI framework from Microsoft. Silverlight was out around the same time. We won't talk about that. Next up, in 2015, with Windows 8, we got UWP, or the Universal Windows Platform. That was the successor to the earlier Windows 8 apps, which worked on the phone, Windows Desktop. UWP you could also use with Xbox and HoloLens. And then quite a few years later, 2021, the successor to UWP was WinUI, which is really a lot like UWP, except it's decoupled from the Windows SDK, so it's no longer tied to specific Windows versions. With UWP, in order to get new features in your development tools, you had to wait for a new Windows SDK to ship, which was tied to a Windows version. With WinUI, they ship out of band. They have their own releases, and you can use those across multiple versions of Windows. You're not tied to an SDK of Windows. Also that same year, later in the year, we got Blazor Hybrid, and we'll take a look at the Blazor Hybrid, but that's using Blazor within another project, either WPF, Windows Forms, or MAUI. And MAUI also came out around the same time. It was in preview when Blazor Hybrid came out, but it was released in 2022. That's the multi-platform app UI, which lets you take your apps across Windows, Android, and iOS. And we'll talk about a couple of third-party cross-platform options. UNO platform uses UWP, WinUI, flavored XAML, and you can hit all the same platforms as MAUI with that, but you can also target Linux and the web with WebAssembly. And Avalonia UI we won't dive into, but that really gives you the same options as UNO platform, but instead of the WinUI flavored XAML, it's more the WPF XAML. and the what about slide. So these are the things we won't be talking about today. If we had a lot more time, there's other options we could dive into. React Native for Windows is becoming pretty popular. Outlook and the Office apps, those are all React under the covers. There's PWAs, Electron, VB6 is still around. Some examples of different UIs with some of these frameworks. So the first two are both WinForms. The one at the top on that side you'll probably recognize as like a typical WinForms looking app. That's an older version of the app that I'll be demoing today. Below that is also WinForms, and that's been styled with some third-party controls. I believe those are DevExpress controls that have custom controls and theming that you can apply with that. The top center, that's Visual Studio. Most of you probably know that. And Visual Studio, most of that UI is WPF. Some of the legacy dialogues that pop up are still old C++ dialogues, but the majority of it now is moved into WPF for the UI. Below that is a weather app sample built with .NET MAUI. That's an open source app on GitHub. You can go and get that sample. If you search for .NET MAUI weather app sample, you'll find that repository, and you can see how the same app can be run across mobile platforms and Windows. And the two on the right are both, those are examples of WinUI. File Explorer in Windows 11 is now built with WinUI. And the one on the bottom is one of the Apple apps in the App Store. Apple's now building several of their apps using WinUI for the UI framework. Apple Music, the Apple Device Manager app is WinUI, and also the Apple TV app. So we're going to start with Windows Forms. We'll talk about some pros and cons, and then we'll get into the first sample app. So Windows Forms, the biggest pro is the rapid development you can do with it. So you can drag and drop your controls, you can do data binding, and you can get an app built very quickly. There's large third-party control support. It's been around a long time, and all the control vendors out there have a lot of controls and theming capabilities for Windows Forms. There's modern and legacy options, meaning you can build a new project today starting with .NET Framework if you need to target some older operating systems, or you can start a new WinForms project with the latest .NET, .NET 8 or 9, depending on if you need that long-term support in .NET 8. And you can also upgrade existing .NET Framework projects with the .NET Upgrade Assistant. You can take your older Windows Forms project into the current versions of .NET with that. Windows Forms is under active development today. It kind of slowed for a while. Things were quiet on the Windows Forms front, but over the last year or so, they've picked up the pace on new features. They've added some async capabilities, so you can launch dialogues async now. There's some accessibility improvements, high DPI improvements came along, better performance, and new in .NET 9 is some experimental support for dark mode. So your app will automatically turn to dark mode and light mode when you switch your Windows theme. And I have a link up there to the roadmap. You can see the WinForms team's roadmap up on GitHub. And another one of the big advantages is that every C# or VB developer is already a WinForms developer because you don't have to learn any other language. It's all written in C# and VB. A few drawbacks. We saw in the screenshots, it's a little bit dated looking still, even with the refreshes they've been doing lately. It doesn't look quite as new as some of the other frameworks. There's no support for that Windows 11 look and feel, the fluent design they call it. It looks more like some of the older Windows operating systems when it was first introduced. There's no GPU acceleration built into the UI rendering, so all of your processing is going to be happening on the CPU. There's nothing offloaded to the GPU. There's no C++ support. If you're a C++ developer, you only have C# and VB options. There's no production support yet for dark mode, but like I said, that's out in preview now. There's experimental support for that. And you do still have the third-party theming options that you can rely on if you need to customize the look and feel of your WinForms. And it's not the best option for touch and pen input. If you need to do that, you'll probably want to go with maybe UWP or WinUI would be the best option. So let's switch out of this and take a look at our first demo. So, got a couple of Visual Studios here. So let's zoom in here. So I've got a solution here with everything except my Uno platform project. That needs to be in its own solution file. So in here, you can see I've got Blazor Hybrid, MAUI, 2 different UWP projects. We'll talk about the UWP support later, WinForms, and I've got WinUI and a couple of WPF projects for 8 and 9. So you can see the differences between .NET 8 and .NET 9 with WPF. And most of these projects are sharing the shared project. It's just got an item class and a category class, our categories for our shopping list. That'll populate a dropdown, and then items for holding the items in our shopping list. And the shopping list helper just builds a little bit of dummy data in memory for us. So let's just take a look at that helper. You can see it's pretty simple. It just has create categories, create the shopping list items, and then in our Windows form project, it'll look a lot like that screenshot. So we've got some entry controls at the top for adding new items, and then a grid below that to list all the current items in the shopping list. And in the code behind that, we've just got some classes to hold our items and categories. We populate those in the constructor, set the data source for the Dropbox, the combo box, and the grid. And we've got a little bit of code to add items and delete items. Let's run that. Starts up quick. It looks like a WinForm. And I can select items to add here. I can add a donut to the list. Adds that. I can check items as purchased. And I can delete items. There's also a delete item at the bottom that does the same thing. So pretty simple app. You'll see the same kind of app for all the other languages, the frameworks, and let's jump back to our slides. So WPF is up next. So it uses XAML for the UI. If you're not familiar with XAML, it's a schema-bound XML markup language. It's got support for data binding, styling, loading static and dynamic resources. XAML is used by WPF, by MAUI, WinUI. They all have slightly different flavors or schemas for their XAML. But if you know one, it's pretty easy to pick up the others. Visual Studio does have a UI designer for WPF, so you can click and drag your items. You can select controls and set properties in the property pane, so it's pretty easy if you don't know XAML yet to pick it up by using the designer. It doesn't always build the cleanest XAML, so not everybody that's used XAML for a while likes to build through the designer, but it's there if you're new. Let's see, like I mentioned before, WinForms doesn't have GPU acceleration with the UI, but WPF has that. It uses the DirectX pipeline for that rendering and improving the performance. It's got the rich data binding like I mentioned. You can use the MVVM pattern for your data binding. You have your views and your view models. Like WinForms has that modern and the legacy support, so you can have a .NET Framework project, or you can have a .NET 8 or 9 project. And you can also use the Upgrade Assistant to upgrade older projects. It also has been around a while, so there's a lot of third-party library support, control support. There's theming like you have with WinForms. It's also under active development, and they publish their roadmap up on GitHub. So Windows 11 theming support is new in .NET 9, and they've refreshed the UI a little bit. And you'll see the difference in the two projects, how things look different with that. It looks a lot more like a WinUI project now. They're using a lot of the same stylings that WinUI is using on their controls. So it's great for native enterprise apps. It really does multi-window stuff very well, just like Windows Forms. Not all of the frameworks do multi-window as well. But some of the drawbacks, there's the XAML learning curve. If you're not crazy about XAML, you've got to learn that before you can build your UI. There's no C++ support like WinForms. We had to strike through this no fluent design because the latest .NET 9 is a lot more like WinUI and MVUI, so .NET 9 has taken care of that item for us. It's much better for touch and pen support than Windows Forms. It's not as good as UWP and WinUI, but it's a lot better than Windows Forms. And the UI performance is much better using that GPU, but it's not quite as optimized as UWP and WinUI as well. So let's switch again to the Visual Studio. We'll start with the WPF8. And before we dive into the code, I'll run the WPF8, then we'll look at the code for 8 and 9, and then we'll run 9. So it looks a lot like the Windows Forms. It's a little bit more modern, maybe. The one difference is I have my delete buttons in the rows. I had some issues with Windows Forms with that, with some events firing after the row was deleted. But we can add some items to the list, just like Windows Forms. Delete items, check items. Everything works just the same, just slightly more modern looking, but still not super Windows 11-y. So the differences in the code here, you'll see we have a main window, which is XAML. And I've been having some weird clicking issues. So you can see you have a designer up here, and you've got the XAML window below. You can select items, and it jumps to the item that's selected in the XAML below, so you can see what you're looking at. Click on the grid. It scrolls your data grid into view here. And I have my code behind, just like Windows Forms. I'm doing everything in code behind. I'm not using MVVM in this project. We'll see an example of using view models when we get to WinUI. So the code is similar. I've got some collections to load my items into, grabbing those from the helper class, and I'm setting my source and my item source when the window gets loaded. So I've add button, delete button code, and I'm clearing the entry fields after I add. So the one difference in WPF9 project, everything here is pretty much the same, but in the app.xaml, which is an application-wide file, I'm loading up a fluent.xaml, which will load the more modern-looking UI. So let's set that as the startup and take a look at the difference. You see, just by switching from .NET 8 to .NET 9 and putting that one line in there, it looks a lot different. And it's picked up my dark mode from my OS automatically, so I've got dark mode running. The styling isn't quite perfect yet. I haven't done any custom styles here, and you can see when you highlight a row, it's not really easy to read the delete button text, so you'd have to do some custom styles to fix that. But it functions just the same. I can add some cream to the list. So switch back to the slides, and we'll jump to the next framework. There we go. UWP is next, and we'll be pretty quick with UWP. It is still supported, but you'll see there's an asterisk next to it. These advantages aren't necessarily a reason to use UWP going forward for new projects. So one of the advantages is the .NET Native optimization. So before .NET 9, this was a much bigger advantage. So what that does is it strips out some of the extra code and things you don't need. It gives you a smaller memory footprint. It gives you faster startup times, which is what you get with AOT with .NET 9. The reason they had this in .NET Native was because you had your UWP apps running on Windows phones, which had a smaller amount of memory, less processing, so you had to have as small and executable as possible to run on there. It was built to perform on Windows, Xbox, and the phones with the limited resources there. It's got Xbox and HoloLens support, although HoloLens is going away. You do have a XAML designer just like WPF, so you can drag and drop your controls. It's very good for touch and pen input. You get Windows theme support. Dark mode has always been part of that. Rich data binding support with MVVM, just like WPF and the other XAML frameworks. You have a set of controls called the WinUI 2 controls, and those are controls that you can add into UWP to get some extra functionality. They give you some of that fluent design look, but it's more the Windows 10 fluent design. It doesn't look as modern as like the Windows 11 that you get with WinUI and the newer WPF. And it has security with Windows sandboxing, meaning it can only access certain parts of the file system unless you declare additional capabilities, which can be seen in the Microsoft Store, kind of like in mobile apps where your app has to tell you what it does. Does it access your location? Does it have more access to the file system? All of that has to be declared with UWP apps as well. And it does now have some preview support for .NET 9 that just came out in the last couple of months. So you can migrate your UWP apps to .NET 9. And the reason for that is twofold. One is they see it as an intermediate step to take your apps from UWP to WinUI. You can take the first step of upgrading to .NET 9. And the other reason is to try and get people off of .NET Native so they can take advantage of the newer C# and .NET features. So drawbacks. It's still supported, but it's in maintenance mode now. So there's no more feature updates coming other than that .NET 9 uplift. It's getting only bug fixes and security updates. There's going to be no new updates to the WinUI 2 controls either. Those are just in maintenance mode as well. .NET Native, if you stick with that, it means that you don't get the modern .NET features. You don't get any C# language features after C# 8 with .NET Native. And so .NET 9, if you upgrade to that, you'll get all the latest C# features. There's no Fluent UI updates. So like I said, it looks more like Windows 10 than Windows 11. The support lifetime is unknown. It's supported for now, but there's no timetable for retiring it, but that's kind of a unknown hanging out there. .NET Standard libraries. So if you're not moving to .NET 9, you have to rely on .NET Standard, which is not really a thing anymore. It's still out there, but now that .NET runs everywhere, .NET itself has become the standard. So not every third-party library is supporting .NET Standard anymore. MSOL, the Microsoft security libraries, announced that they're no longer supporting .NET Standard or Xamarin and UWP. And it's also tied to the Windows SDK versions, like I mentioned earlier. Let's switch again. And so I have two UWP projects. The first one we'll look at is running the traditional .NET Native. So this is doing the same thing, everything in the code behind. And if we run that, see it picks up dark mode automatically. I get the nice hover effects. I don't know if you can see, but it kind of changes the light to follow the mouse cursor. Everything is kind of squared off, though. That looks more like Windows 10 than Windows 11. If I add an item, add some corn to the list, you see how the item kind of fades in at the bottom. You get little animations. If I delete an item, the others are going to slide up. It kind of disappears and things slide up kind of nicely. And then I have my UWP new project, which is the same thing but running on .NET 9. You see it starts up a little bit faster, but everything functions just the same, except there's a bug in the drop-down list where it's not displaying the items. But I believe the last item in the category list was snacks. I'm going to add some crisps. There we go. We've got crisps on the list now. We'll say we bought those. And everything looks the same with the animations, things sliding up. And here you can see you get the UI designer just like you have with WPF. So you can select your items, it jumps to them down in the XAML. You can go to properties. You can set your properties over in the properties pane and it'll update your XAML for you. So it's handy if you're new to XAML and you're just learning how to use that language. So let's switch back to here. So next up is WinUI. So WinUI looks a lot like UWP. The XAML is exactly the same. The only difference is namespaces. So things that were in Windows namespace are now under a Microsoft namespace. You just swap that out, and you can pretty much upgrade your UWP to WinUI pretty easily. If it's all simple, you don't have a lot of third-party stuff built into it. WinUI is part of the Windows App SDK. It's technically called WinUI 3 because we had the WinUI 2 controls for UWP, but most people now are just dropping the 3 and calling it WinUI. It supports the latest Fluent design. It'll look a lot like that WPF app that we saw. Looks like Windows 11. You get the features and controls of UWP without being coupled to the operating system version. With a WinUI project in C#, you can also access APIs from, you get Windows App SDK APIs, you can access most of the Windows Runtime APIs. So Windows Runtime APIs are what you get with UWP. The only ones you won't be able to use are things that are tightly coupled to UWP UI, like the controls and things. But most of the rest of the Windows Runtime SDK you can use with WinUI apps as well. And you can also use .NET APIs. So because it's running on .NET 9, you can use all your .NET APIs that you'd use in your other desktop apps or libraries. It gets frequent updates. So in versions 1.2 to 1.5, they added XAML islands, which is a way to interop between WinUI and other frameworks. That is kind of limited right now. It only supports C++ projects. It also added some theming enhancements, notifications API, so you could get your little toast notifications in your app. It added an app window for some more advanced windowing support. And maps control and a media player control were added in those releases. 1.6 came out last year. That added the AOT like you get with .NET 9, so you can have your faster startup, your smaller memory footprint. Got improvements to the title bar, so you could more easily customize your title bar. Got binding, XBind, and IntelliSense improvements. And they also started some work on some of the 1.7 controls that are going to be coming out soon. 1.7 work includes some security improvements. The OAuth 2 support is coming. That's something people have been asking for a long time. There's some AI APIs, the Windows Copilot Runtime, they're calling it. That's supposed to be coming out in the 3rd experimental release in a few days. And then camera capture UI, so you can do camera capture with any supported camera on Windows. And the big thing that's coming, well, the work is starting in 1.7. It won't be released yet, but currently WinUI doesn't have a XAML designer like the other frameworks, so you have to hand code all your XAML code for the UI, but they're starting to work on that designer with the 1.7 work. And like the others, there's a GitHub roadmap. You can go out there and see what's being worked on and the status of things. So there's C# and C++ support with WinUI. There's no VB support, no F# support. You get the MVVM data binding like the other XAML frameworks. It's great for touch and pen input, just like UWP. You can upgrade from UWP using the .NET Upgrade Assistant, like you can do with the WinForms and WPF projects. And right now, Microsoft is really positioning WinUI as the top choice for most use cases. So if the features fit what you're looking to do, they're pushing that as the top choice. And they're showing that by using it themselves in things like File Explorer and partnering with people like Apple and Adobe to put some of their apps out there on the App Store that use WinUI. So some of the drawbacks, the XAML designer is a big one for a lot of people. It's not there now, but it's coming hopefully very soon. They announced that they were starting to work in 1.7, like I said, so there's the XAML learning curve that'll be eliminated. And you can currently use XAML hot reload, so you can start debugging your app, make some simple changes in your XAML, and when you save it, it reloads the UI for you without having to stop and restart your debugging session. Like I said, no F# or VB support. There's no Xbox or HoloLens support like you get with UWP, so if you're looking to upgrade your UWP project, you won't be able to bring forward any Xbox or HoloLens apps at this time. And the other big one that's out on a GitHub issue that's a popular one with people is UI validation. So when you're writing your UI and you put those little red exclamation points next to fields automatically when they're required and somebody didn't enter that, that's not currently supported built in to WinUI. It's one of the top requested features that's still outstanding. And there are some workarounds you can do. They started work on it early on, and there's still some code out there you can find to make it work. In my book, Learn WinUI 3, I used that workaround to make those notifications for validation work. And let's take a look at that project. So, the WinUI project. This one's going to be a little bit different than the others because I used MVVM. So the XAML, it looks pretty much the same as the UWP XAML. Like I said, the only thing that's different are the namespaces. In the code behind, you'll see there's almost nothing there, unlike the other projects. So in here, all I'm doing is setting up my view model, and I kept some delete button code in here too, but all the logic for this is in my main view model. And if you're familiar with doing MVVM and implementing iNotify property change, you'll see I don't have any of that stuff in here. I'm using the MVVM toolkit, which is part of the .NET community toolkit that you can get. So all you have to do to implement that is inherit from observable object in the toolkit, and you have to make your view model a partial class. Because what it does is it uses the source generators to generate another partial class behind the scenes that creates your public properties, your commands, and things that you'd normally have to write yourself. So for the categories that we bind to our drop-down box, all I have is a private property, and I set it as an observable property. So the source generator in .NET will create my public property for me with the capital C categories that we use for data binding. So the same thing for items, and there's some other things you can do with it on your commands. So the item name is another observable property, but I'm also telling it that The add command button relies on this property, so anytime this changes, check this to see if I should enable the add command or not. So I want to make sure that I have an item name and I have a selected category before I enable that add button. So I put that attribute on both of these so that that check will fire down here. I have a can add item that checks to see if item name is populated and if the selected category is not null. And then I have my private add command with a relay command set up on there to tell it, check can add item before you enable this command for the UI to enable the button. So let's switch to that project up here. Yeah, this looks a lot like the, it's kind of a cross between the WPF project and the UWP project. I have a little bit of hover effect, and I have the nice sliding up like I have with UWP, but I also have the rounded corners like you have elsewhere in Windows 11. Can select a new item to add. I'll add some crisps again. And that fades in at the bottom pretty nicely. Switch back to the slides, and up next, we're going to be talking about .NET MAUI. So some .NET MAUI advantages. So .NET MAUI is a cross-platform option, like I said earlier. You can target Windows, Android, iOS, Mac OS, and Tizen, which has Samsung's watches and TVs. It doesn't have Linux support. It's cross-platform, and you can also do some platform-specific implementations if you need things to happen differently on one platform or another. MAUI also has some helpers to help abstract some of that stuff for you, so like accessing things like the camera, file system stuff. There are helpers to help you do that without having to write it differently for each platform. You can change the appearance by platform. So you can have things look differently on Android or iOS. In the XAML, they have an on-platform markup extension. So you can say on-platform iOS, I want to have this set of XAML. On-platform Android, I want to do this. On-platform Windows, do this. It's easy to learn if you already know XAML. It's a slightly different flavor of XAML. Some of the controls are named a little differently. But if you know UWP or WPF, you can pick up MAUI pretty easily. You can also create your UI entirely in C# if you don't want to use XAML. There's the C# markup in the .NET MAUI Community Toolkit that helps you do some fluent stuff to design your UI. You can use the MVU, the Model View Update pattern, similar to how Flutter UIs are built. And when you compile from Windows and run on Windows, it's actually building a WinUI app under the covers. So you'll see when we run it, it looks a lot like the WinUI app, except MAUI is pretty crazy about purple, so there's some purple buttons and things. You can develop with Visual Studio if you're on Windows. If you have a Mac, you can build MAUI apps with VS Code. They have a MAUI extension that you can install to run and debug your apps on Mac. And web developers can use Blazor Hybrid to build Blazor apps inside their mobile, or they can take pieces of their existing Blazor app and run it inside their MAUI mobile apps. So some drawbacks. So there are cases where you're going to need to write some platform-specific code to access native features. It's still better than writing an entire separate app for each platform. Unless you need performance, then native for each platform is usually the fastest way to go. There's only C# support, no C++, F# or VB. You can use F# with a Blazor hybrid project. So if you have just your shell of your MAUI app in C#, then inside your Blazor part of the project, you can have all your F# code in there. Windows support is there, but iOS and Android are still their top options. With Xamarin being retired last year, there's still a pretty big focus on getting everybody moved off of Xamarin over to MAUI. So any support stuff that comes in, they have their team focusing on making sure that iOS and Android are working just as well with MAUI as they did with Xamarin. So if you're just targeting Windows, you'll want to use WinUI rather than MAUI. There are some limits on UI customization. If you do a lot of control customization, not every control have control templates available to customize. Even the button control in MAUI, you can't dive into a custom control template for that. And performance. It gets better with every release, but like I said, native is always the fastest way to go with mobile apps and Windows apps as well. Let's dive into that MAUI app. There we go. So here's our MAUI app. You can see even though this can target every different platform, there's just a single main page for the UI. Anything platform specific goes under these platform folders. So if we open up the main page, it's pretty similar to the others. For the part at the top, I'm using a scroll view wrapping a vertical stack layout rather than just having the grid at the top view. And then I've still got a list view for the items. And instead of a drop-down control, they call it a picker. Text box is called an entry. So it's the same kind of layout, but things are named slightly differently. And if I switch to the MAUI project to run it, you'll see I get some different options here. By default, it goes to Windows machine for debugging, but you can also pick Android devices. With Windows, you can currently still use the Windows subsystem for Android for debugging on Android. That is going away in March. That's been deprecated, so you won't have that option any longer. You'll have to use the Google emulators. You can debug iOS if you have a Mac attached to your network. We're going to stick with Windows and run that. And I have been having some MAUI issues today. That's why I have Task Manager running. Let me try it once more before I resort to Task Manager. There it goes. So it's a WinUI app that we launched here. It looks a little bit different, like I said. Everything is default purple in MAUI. The buttons default to purple if you don't style them yourself. We've got a purple title up here. But I've got the same list of categories. You can add an item. And we get that same fade effect, the same mouse over effects. Things fade up when I delete. And I'm not going to run on Android for time, but you can see if you resize, things will still fit if you're kind of in an Android aspect there. That is the MAUI app. We're going to finish up with some Blazor hybrid, and then we should have time to show the Uno project as well. All right. Oops. All right, so switch to Blazor hybrid. So Blazor hybrid, you can leverage your web skills, your Blazor skills on native platforms. Like I said, you can do Blazor hybrid with .NET MAUI, which has templates right out of the box. So you can say new project and choose MAUI Blazor hybrid. You can also do it with WPF and WinForms, but it doesn't have templates out of the box. There are pages on Microsoft Learn that give you a few steps to walk through to create your new WPF project and then bring some Blazor files into that to have Blazor hybrid. I've got a link to that at the end of the slide decks that show you how to do that. So there's no XAML learning curve if you're a web developer. You've got your CSS styling. .NET compatibility, so you've got .NET 8, 9, whatever you need to use there. WPF and WinForms as the shell, so you can combine the two as well. You could just have Blazor page on one control, or you could have other controls that are still WPF or WinForms, so you could bring this into an existing project. And the MAUI host, you can do the same thing. So you could have a MAUI app with a whole bunch of pages, and maybe you just have Blazor hosted on one or two of those. So cons, there's usually interop costs when you do interop. You may not see them right away. Sometimes you have performance issues. If there's bugs, say, you kind of double your possible bug impact. So if there's a bug in WPF or MAUI, or there's a bug in Blazor, either one of those could impact you when you're using both of those. You may have accessibility quirks. I've worked on a project before that was a Xamarin mobile app, and we hosted some Angular stuff inside of it, and there were some quirks with accessibility using the web view, trying to get the focus down into the right control to be able to use shortcuts and things like that. And sometimes it feels still kind of like web, not native. You get that bouncy feel to it when you scroll. Let's switch to the Blazor project real quick. So let's zoom in here so you can see this. Ooh. Sorry about that. There we go. All right, so Blazor project. So you'll see we have our main window XAML, that's the WPF window. And we have a shopping list Razor page, that's the main page that's going to be hosted inside the WPF app. And the WW root has your other files that you typically have in the Blazor project. You've got the CSS down inside of there. There's an index page that's going to load up your Razor page. And then you have the app.xaml like you'd have in your other WPF project. So if you look inside the main window XAML, there's almost nothing there. Scroll that up. So we've got the parent grid like you have in most WPF apps, and then inside there, there's a Blazor web view. And inside that, you just need to set your index HTML from the web root. And you need to specify what the root component is going to be. In our case, that's the Razor page we have there for the shopping list. And we'll pop that open. In here, we've got the layout for the shopping list. We've got a bunch of divs for the entry controls at the top, and then a table with header and body for the list of items. And we've got our C# code below that for adding items, setting the shopping list with the helpers, grabbing stuff from there, and a little bit of code to handle the checkboxes. So we'll run this, and you will see that I am not a web developer. My CSS skills are not awesome. But it functions just the same. We can select the category, add it to the list, and it goes at the bottom. And I can delete my items. So everything works just the same, and everything you see there is Blazor inside of the WPF shell. All right, we've still got a few minutes left, so we should have time to look at Uno. So everything here about Uno is also true of Avalonia, which is the WPF version of that. They're two different companies. They are third-party companies, which could be one of the drawbacks that we'll get to. So it's cross-platform, just like MAUI, but on top of the Android, Windows, iOS, macOS, you also get web and Linux support. So for web, it uses WebAssembly to load everything from the .NET project up into the browser. And you can also, just like MAUI, write platform-specific code if you need some things to be specific to iOS or Android. So for Windows, they have some legacy support with SKIA and WPF if you need to target some older operating systems. And then the newer stuff uses WinUI under the covers. So just like MAUI, when you run on Windows 11, it's going to be a WinUI app that launches. And the WinUI Uno apps are nearly identical to your plain old WinUI apps. The code I have in my Uno project and the code, I have an Uno chapter in my book as well. And all I did to create that was just copy paste all the code. As long as your namespaces are the same, you can copy paste exactly into your Uno project if it's simple enough. It supports C# markup just like Uno, so you don't have to write XAML. You could write everything in your C# code for your UI. So you can use the MVU pattern or the MVVM with XAML. They have a Figma plugin, so if you have a design staff at your company, you can have them design your UI with Figma, hand the files off to you, and create your Uno app from those Figma designs. They have themes to support Fluent Design on Windows. They have Material Design for Android and Apple's Cupertino design for iOS. And you can develop with Visual Studio, VS Code, or JetBrains Rider with Uno. So some drawbacks, no VB, no F#. It's a third-party solution, so if your company isn't always crazy about vetting a third party or deciding to pull in some third-party options, you may have to clear some hurdles for that. If you need advanced support, that's a pay option to add on to that from their engineering team. There's no XAML designer. Well, there is a XAML designer that's in preview, but there's no XAML designer that's officially out yet. You use hot reload. Some platform-specific code is required for native features like MAUI, and it can be not as performant as native apps, like we said with MAUI. So let's take a look at the Uno project. So for the Uno project, I just pulled my item and category and helper classes into the project here, since it's in its own solution. And like the other XAML projects, I have a main page, and I brought my main view model over from WinUI. This was all just copy-pasted over from the WinUI project. You can also use the MVVM toolkit code here, so everything is pretty simple. And in the main page XAML, this is just all copy-pasted from the WinUI project. So in here, just like with MAUI project, you can select the different platforms. You can do the Windows App SDK on Windows. It's got WebAssembly. And I don't have the Android and iOS options set up here, but you can add those as well when you create your new project. Let's run this Windows app. And it looks exactly like the WinUI app because that's what it is. It's just running WinUI. And it functions the same with the same animations. So if you need to target all those different platforms, you have folks running on Linux. You can look at either Uno or Avalonia for that support. So choosing a framework. I stole a couple of graphics from, this was from Ignite last year. The WinUI team did a demo on some WinUI and WPF pros and cons themselves. So Power's key experience on Windows. Like I said, the File Explorer and other apps are starting to use WinUI. It's optimized for current hardware today, support for C#, C++, and it's got modern-looking UI, usability and accessibility. It's all built into it. And WPF with .NET 9, it's been around a long time. It's proven. C#, it's written in C# just like the rest of .NET. And rich and stable ecosystem. Like I said, a lot of third-party control vendors, those theme vendors. You can get all that stuff pulled into your project. I listed a few things that you can consider when you're choosing it. What programming language does your dev team use? Do you need that drag and drop designer if you're going to be getting into XAML? What UI design language do you want to use? Are you comfortable using XAML at all? Do you maybe want to go with Blazor if you're a lot of web developers that know .NET? Do you need legacy support with .NET Framework? Touch support, how important is that to you? Do you need to go cross-platform someday? Maybe you're starting on Windows, but you want to move to other mobile platforms in the future. And do the current features meet your current needs in that framework? WinUI, it is a really great choice, but they are still building that feature set out to match UWP. And this is just a list of some features. So if you look up on GitHub, my username is just Alvin Ashcraft, all one word, and I have a repo called Speaking. And up on there, I've got all my slides, all my demos from all my talks over the last couple of years. So you can grab these slides, these projects. And I've got links to my books, all my social links up there. And I've got a slide for the Microsoft folks downstairs. So if you haven't been to the Microsoft booth, you could stop down there, get your questions answered. I don't know if they're still setting up meetings anymore. I know that was a lot of that was yesterday. But after this, I'm also going to be going down there if you have additional questions. And I do have 2 copies of my book with me I'd like to give away. If anybody has some questions and you're interested in the WinUI book, you can stop down and talk to me there after this. And that's it. Thank you very much. And